Welcome to this brief Bible dive with beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and with me, Pastor Nick. These are brief times that we take a deep, but that, again, brief dive under the surface of a Bible story, bring up a precious pearl or two, and see how they apply to our daily lives, maybe thousands and thousands of years after these stories were first heard or written down. Also, we'd love for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, share this video with somebody that you think would really benefit from it, like the video, and of course, select to receive notifications. Now, this brief Bible dive is going to go into a very short chapter of the Bible. It's Isaiah chapter 20. And before we get into this story, we just have to admit something. This is a very bizarre story. It fits great with our bizarre Bible story worship series that we're doing right now. Why is it bizarre? Well, for one, we hear about a prophet who's preaching naked, without his clothing on. Not only that, we hear that the prophet didn't do this because the prophet somehow lost his mind. Isaiah, the prophet, did this because God asked him to do it. That does quite make it bizarre. Now, I'm sure we can all agree that we're also grateful that that is not a normal thing God calls upon people to do, asking them to preach naked. So let's listen to this story. We're going to discuss it and ask ourselves the following question throughout. When has God led me to do something out of the ordinary? So the question for you is, when has God led me to do something out of the ordinary? We're using the New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, and let's listen to this story as found in the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. In the year that the commander-in-chief, who was sent by King Sargon of Assyria, came to Ashdod and fought against it and took it. At that time, the Lord had spoken to Isaiah, son of Amos, saying, "Go and loose the sackcloth from your loins and take your sandals off your feet." And he had done so, walking naked and barefoot. Then the Lord said, "Just as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and a portent against Egypt and Ethiopia, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Ethiopians as captives, and the Egyptians as captives, and the Ethiopians as exiles. Both the young and the old, naked and barefoot, with buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. And they shall be dismayed and confounded because of Ethiopia their hope, and of Egypt their boast. In that day the inhabitants of this coastline will say, 'See, this is what has happened to those in whom we hoped, and to whom we fled for help and deliverance from the king of Assyria. And we, how shall we escape?'" So again, we're just going to name the obvious. This is weird. Not only does God call a prophet to walk around on the streets preaching naked and barefoot, but in verse 3, we learn that God called the prophet to do this for 3 years. 3 years. Now, God's prophets were certainly known to do some things that are a little bit out of the ordinary. We hear in Jeremiah chapter 13 that Jeremiah, the prophet, hid his underwear in the cleft of a rock at God's command, and then later retrieved it at God's command. Ezekiel ate a scroll, and at one point laid on his side for 390 days as a symbolic reminder of the nation's 390 days of sinning against God. The prophet Hosea married a prostitute and then named his daughters unloved and not my people. How would you like to get that from your parents? John the Baptizer dressed in camel's hair and ate locusts and wild honey in the wilderness. I mean, these prophets were known for doing things out of the ordinary, sometimes pretty weird. And because of that, many of these prophets hung on the fringes of society. But here's the thing about Isaiah. Isaiah used to spend a lot of time in the capital of Jerusalem. He tended to be well respected. He spent his time around the educated, the elite, the urban group of people in the area. In other words, most of these other prophets, they may have been invited, to use modern terms, they may have been invited to a dinner party because, they would have been odd and it would have been fun. But Isaiah would have been invited to those parties simply because, well, he was a friend of people that were considered respectable. This all means that it would have been an even greater shock for people to see Isaiah walk around the streets of the capital naked, and for 3 years, no less. And so now we ask this question: why? Why in the world would God ask Isaiah to do something like this? Well, it happened because the people of the Jewish kingdom of Judah became terrified by the approaching Assyrian army, and terrified rightly so. The Assyrians had just conquered the Philistine town of Ashdod, a town that appears again in the book of Acts, but it's known by a different name, Azotus, Azotus, Azotus. And in this conquering of Ashdod, we know it actually took place in 711 BC. I mean, we are almost 100% certain of this date because of the archaeological evidence as well as Assyrian records. You know, it's one of these serendipitous moments where information within the Bible and information outside of the Bible and information we're uncovering now, it all lines up perfectly. 711 BC. So these Assyrians who conquered Ashdod, they were known for to be some of the most brutal conquerors in history. I mean, sometimes armies were brutal, but still had a compassionate streak. You know, some conquerors would spare the children's lives, and maybe the mothers' lives with the children. Some conquerors, like the Babylonians, well, they could be pretty tough, but maybe they still took people into captivity and gave them a somewhat elite positions in their society. Some conquerors, like the Romans, well, they would sell people into slavery, not a good thing, but they also didn't massacre the people all the time. They did with Carthage, but not necessarily every civilization. Certainly a lot of pain would come from these conquerors. I mean, we can't support exile, we can't support slavery, and so of course the scale of the oppressions widely varied. But the thing about the Assyrians, they just tortured and killed everybody. They tortured and killed them without pause. Yes, sure, they might have taken a few into exile without killing them. We hear some allusions to that even in this story, but they often did this while stripping them of their clothing, puncturing chains through people's noses so that they all had to walk together in torment over an untold distance. Now, since the people of Judah were afraid of suffering this fate, and again, rightly so, afraid of it, they wanted help. But what did they do? They wanted to turn to another superpower of the world, not turn to the superpower of the Assyrians, but turn to the Egyptians, who at the time were allied with the Ethiopians. Now let's just think about our biblical history. This is how desperate these people were. They wanted Egyptian support. And the Egyptians had once enslaved and tormented their Hebrew ancestors. The same slaves led out of Egypt by Moses to the promised land where they now lived. They wanted to turn to them for help. But the message from Isaiah was that the people were looking the wrong place for help. The people should turn instead to God for help. And furthermore, if the people allied with the Egyptians and Ethiopians, Isaiah said that they would be conquered and led through the street naked. Naked, hence Isaiah's very graphic 3-year-long metaphor that he displayed as he walked through the streets preaching. But more so, his point wasn't just that's how they'd be taken away and, the few in exile or led or whatever or tormented, but they would be led away in defeat and humiliation and in disgrace. Isaiah was showing the people the consequences of turning to a foreign superpower rather than trusting in the living God who had been faithful to them the whole time. And the good news is this: thankfully for the people, they got the message. Thankfully for these people, they turned back to God in faith. And sure enough, when the Assyrians came to the walls of Jerusalem, the Assyrian army was struck with a horrific plague, and so they retreated. Eventually, the Assyrians would return to the area, but sort of bypassed Jerusalem, where this plague occurred, maybe a little bit superstitious there, And they did wind up conquering the Egyptians and Ethiopians. And of course, in the process, they took these Egyptians and Ethiopians away as slaves and exiles, marching them naked over long stretches of land. What Isaiah said would happen is exactly what happened. This brings us back to that question for this brief Bible dive. When has God led me to do something out of the ordinary? Now, it's a good thing that Isaiah followed this call by God to do something quite out of the ordinary, very weird, very bizarre. And it's an even better thing that the people listened to Isaiah, trusted in God, and that they were saved from their enemies. But when has God asked you to do something weird, and how did you respond? I mean, certainly it's always good to check with fellow people of faith to see what they think about what you believe you heard from God, because after all, the message we hear in our minds may not be from God. It might simply be something we've been ruminating on, just thinking up, or maybe even worse, it might have an evil source to it. But with all of that in mind, we ponder what God has led us to do. And I ask you to do the same, to ponder what has God led you to do that's out of the ordinary, and how did it go? Ponder that throughout this week, or whenever it is you're listening to this, for however long. So thanks again for joining with me and with Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan for this brief Bible dive. To learn more about our congregation, go to the website bslcmi.org. And I have to say again, it'd be great if you could like this video, share it with anybody that you think would find it really helpful, subscribe to that YouTube channel, and click that bell to receive notifications. Now, go out and love God and love your neighbors.